The Siege of Jerusalem, The Push for Religious Righteousness, Nicholas Gamp. The long and grueling First Crusade, called by Pope Urban II to capture significant Muslim holdings in the Levant, culminated in June of 1099 at the Siege of Jerusalem, a battle for the major holy city of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. This is the turning point which impacted the next 400 years of politics in Europe and in the Middle East, leading to the collapse of empires, restoration of the spice and silk trade, and a large shift of power and faith from the Catholic Church to smaller denominations of Christianity. The siege was the final push needed by the Catholics to complete their sacred goal of conquering the Holy Land from the Muslims. Though it only lasted 8 days, it left a lasting impact still felt to this day, and it is still affecting global politics. Though the crusade was initiated by the Pope, many decisions were made by predominantly French commanders and noblemen leading the Crusaders, like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond IV of Toulouse. Crusader states would be set up to keep Catholic control in the area and enlarge their military and trade presence. These French noblemen and knights would be the first candidates that would be selected as rulers of the later established Crusader states. The story starts in 1095, in the midst of a war between the Byzantine Empire, led by Alexios I, and the Seljuk Turks, led by Tughril. The Byzantines were losing swaths of land and their soldiers were depleted, so Alexios sent out a call for help to the Pope. Pope Urban II was fond of Alexios, and he was happy to send help, but he saw an opportunity to take the Holy Land of Jerusalem from the Muslims. The city has religious importance to the Catholic Christians for it being the homeland of Christianity and the birthplace of Abraham, the father of all Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Pope Urban II initiated the crusade at the Council of Clermont in November of 1095. This speech would be sent out to many Catholic kingdoms, urging them to participate in what would be later called the First Crusade. He ended the speech by saying, "Let them eagerly set out on the way with God as their guide," sparking zealous enthusiasm between kings and nobles. Alexios predicted this and forced a treaty to be signed between the Byzantines and Crusaders, stating that all recaptured lands taken from the Byzantines and controlled by the Seljuks would be returned to Alexios' control. Remember this treaty, for it is important. In May of 1097, Crusaders had arrived at the first Muslim-controlled city of the First Crusade, Nicaea. There was a skirmish as the Crusaders started to near the city, which left the Muslims on the retreat. The siege was less successful, though, as the siege tower that the Crusaders had built was quickly in disrepair and had to use heavy Byzantine support to force an attack on the city. A surrender was issued by the Muslims and the city was firmly back under Byzantine control. Later reports suggest that Alexios had bribed or somehow convinced the surrender from the Muslims to ensure they land in their hands. The Crusaders marched onto the crucial city of Antioch in Syria. Antioch would have been considered a metropolis by 1097 standards, and the siege which took place would end up being one of the most well-recounted events of the Crusade. Antioch was the most heavily defended city that the Crusaders would face. There was constant reinforcements being pulled from across the Seljuk Empire that would use ropes and ladders to climb into the city at night. Attacks were launched by the Crusaders, which only weakened the siege, leaving gaps that were exploited by Muslim soldiers and cavalry which were sent out. After the lines fortified, Godfrey I suggested a collective push by the Crusaders at one point on the wall. He gathered the troops on one side of the wall and launched an attack which would become successful in taking the city. Some days later, Kerboga, a feared Seljuk archer and general, was sent on a counterattack mission to retake the recently captured city. Gaston IV, a soldier under Raymond IV, became infamous for his exploits during the defense against the counterattack. Kerboga would be killed along with most of his men. The Seljuks were in an ongoing war with the Fatimids in Egypt, and these losses heavily damaged the Seljuks and their military, leading to the loss of Jerusalem and totality of Palestine to them in late 1098. This would give the Crusaders a chance to sidestep the agreement between the Pope and Byzantines when taking Jerusalem by saying, to the extent of, it's not controlled by the Seljuks, so we don't have to give it back. A long march to Jerusalem started after the successful capture of Antioch. Some small skirmishes occurred along the way, but it was primarily against small retreating forces from besieged cities. The Fatimid mayor, Iftikhar Abdallah of Jerusalem, heard about the marching crusaders and exiled all of the Christian inhabitants of the city to prevent an internal outbreak. He would also poison nearby wells and request reinforcements from Egypt. The crusaders would arrive at Jerusalem on June 7, 1099, and the start of the siege would quickly follow. The crusaders built a siege tower and started dealing massive casualties to the defending Fatimids. They were able to eat away the defending troops until crusaders climbed the walls and forced their way into the city. A massacre would ensue that would kill most of the population of the city. Surprisingly, this would not cripple the city. Some commanders, like Gaston IV, tried to protect the Muslim and Jewish occupants, but their attempts were futile. Up to 10,000 Muslims and Jews did not escape the slaughter. This would place the city firmly in Christian hands, as they set many of the exiled Christians back into the city, made sure to keep a heavy Christian population in place. The city would be held by Christian forces for almost 100 years until the end of the Second Crusade in 1187, when Saladin's forces overran the city. The Christians set up Crusader states, which would be ruled by Crusader kings, and they would be able to autonomously rule themselves in many ways, such as choosing their own leaders and establishing their own laws and government councils. This helped keep stability in the Middle East, as local kings could more easily address issues within the states. There would be 4 Crusader states created: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the counties of Tripoli and Edessa. Nicaea was given back to the Byzantines, and some Crusader states like Antioch and Tripoli would be pseudo under control as Byzantine leaders rose up in their councils. The Byzantine Empire would be irreparably damaged by the Crusade because of both the casualties they sustained, but also their great loss of land. Much of the Byzantine Empire in the Levant and in Africa would be taken by Muslim or Crusader forces. After 2 more crusades and the loss of Jerusalem, Pope Innocent III issued a 4th crusade to attack Egypt and the Fatimids directly in their homeland. On the voyage there, Crusaders took advantage of a weakened Byzantine and sacked Constantinople. This crippled the Byzantine economy and left the port city in shambles. Troops defending Constantinople would have to be drawn from the front with the Fatimids and future Ottoman Turks. In 1453, Byzantine lands were dwindled down to the city of Constantinople and a handful of trade ports around the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. And Constantinople would fall to Muslim forces after a gate in the city wall was left open, giving it into the Roman Empire as a whole. Next, because of the newly opened ports throughout the Middle East, the Silk Road and other trade routes through India and China opened it back up to Europe. This gave an ease of access to Chinese silks and Indian spices, which were so prevalent. European merchants could sail from Mediterranean ports to the Levant and trade without having to travel all the way around the southern tip of Africa. Spices and silk were abandoned by the European peasantry for many years because of the price and how hard it was to attain, but now it could be used and bought by lower classes, even if it was only in small quantities. Another impact of the siege was how much focus and manpower was diverted by the Pope to protect the Holy Land. Much of the Catholic countries in Europe would put up their knights and noblemen to the Knights Templar, a military decree which collected knights for the use of stationing them in Jerusalem. Funding from the church would be almost solely devoted to the following crusades issued by the Pope to retake Jerusalem from the Fatimids. This would all be futile, but it would destroy the Pope's influence, power, and prestige. Eventually, this would lead to the conditions of corruption in the Catholic Church, which would infuriate Protestant pioneers like Martin Luther and incite the Protestant Reformation and split the church and state. The Protestant Reformation would also form the Anglican Church, Puritan Church, and Presbyterian Church, just to name a few. In conclusion, the Siege of Jerusalem was the turning point that incited a ton of change throughout Europe and the Middle East, which is still felt to this day. Many of the changes to how governments and churches would run would change the course of history forever. And our current discoveries might have not happened if there was no trade between Europe and Asia. Not to mention the fact that we would not discover America for many years later if Columbus wasn't trying to find new routes to India to increase trade. The battle over who really owns Palestine and Jerusalem is still prominent today between Jewish, Muslim, and Christian occupants of the country. Future wars and rebellions in Europe and Southeast Asia would be fueled by trade and mercantilism, predominantly pushed by the heavy trade throughout the Middle East. Finally, the Siege of Jerusalem will be a turning point in how we perceive the Pope and his influence on the Catholic world. Many kings would just start to separate themselves from the Pope's rule and question his all-knowing judgment. Thank you for watching my documentary, and I'd like to give some special acknowledgements to several institutions. First is Fordham University and their medieval and Middle Age source books. They are crucial in finding primary and secondary sources for much of my research. The second would be LaGrange College for giving me and my class access to their curated Galileo and special historically focused research help, even including students at the school providing one-on-one assistance. Finally, thank you to the people at NHD.org for setting up so many guides to help with any part of putting together this project and setting up this competition. Thank you.